Good. Now then, for those of you that have a Bible nearby, I'd like you to turn with me to 1 Timothy in chapter 3. I was only thinking on the way to church this morning that there'll come a day when I won't be here. That is, if the Lord doesn't come. I'm not expecting to be carrying on forever. I'm 63 at the minute. Don't know when I'm going to retire, probably when I'm 83 or something like that. But there will come a time when the church will be looking for a new pastor one day. Of course, I'm not just the pastor, I'm an elder with pastoral responsibilities. That's what was said of me when I came, and that's a much more biblical way of understanding my role. I'm not a pastor, but an elder with pastoral. Do you want to come and sit around where you can see me to the face? Because you'll have a crick in the neck by the end of it. That's better. Now I can see you now. Good. So in 1 Timothy chapter 3, Paul is writing to Timothy. Now he's already told him a lot of this stuff in the past, but he's writing to Timothy to remind him. And by putting it down on parchment, Timothy is able to read it again and again and again and again. And he's going to talk about the offices of the church. There are two main offices of the church. Two main offices. One is that of the overseer, and the other is that of the deacon. Okay. Sometimes we use the word elder, and we use the word evangelist, and so on. There's various words that we use for church leadership, but this particular one that we're going to start with is the word overseer, and it has the idea of somebody that is a shepherd. That's why we use the word pastor, because it's pastoral. Pastoral has to do with the grass. That's pasture, isn't it? I remember a man talking very foolishly one day. He said, when the farmer ploughs the pasture, farmers never plough pasture. Why is that? Pasture's always grass. He ploughs the field. He doesn't plough pasture. Pasture has to do with grass, and it's where sheep feed. And so that's what a pastor is. He's the shepherd of sheep. See? That's where the concept comes. But the word overseer is the biblical word, and it means somebody that looks after people. Overseer. He oversees people. He looks out over a number of people and cares for them. And there's lots of other things that he does. So we're going to begin in chapter 3, verse 1. And Paul says this is a true saying. So what he means by this is a true saying is that this is a proverb that was spoken in the church. There's a number of proverbs in the New Testament which were like common sayings, which were true sayings, he says. I mean, there's lots of sayings that people have that aren't true, but this is one that is true. He says it is a true saying. If a man desire the office of a bishop, then he desires a good work. Now, let me just stop a moment there. The first thing we need to understand is when the King James Version was being proposed to be translated, good King James got together the bishops of the Church of England who were Presbyterian in nature. He got them together and he said, look, we need to have a translation because the whole of England was full of the Geneva Bible. People had Geneva Bibles. They were small. I haven't got one like it here, but they were small, they were compact, they were beautifully produced, but they were Protestant. Sadly, King James was a little bit too Presbyterian for that, so he wanted to have a translation that would have his particular peculiarities included. And he said to the translators, he said, now you're to take the Great Bible. Now we all know what the Great Bible was. It was huge. It's the ones that you see chained to big pulpits in the Church of England today. They're called the Great Bible. They were very large indeed. You're to take the Great Bible, and you are to make as few changes as possible. But there are some changes I'm going to stipulate. I don't want you to say the word overseer. I want you to use the word bishop, because I have bishops and they want to be in it. Got it? Also, he said, I want you to not use the word preordination, which is what Wycliffe had. I want you to use the word predestination. The word predestination should never be in the Bible. It conveys completely the wrong idea. It's ordination. Preordination is what God has done. And ordination, as you know, is quite a different thing to destiny, quite a different thing. He also said, I don't want you to use the word assembly, which is what Wycliffe had in his Bible. I want you to use the word church. Why? Because he was the head of the church, and he wanted the word church to be in the Bible. So in this particular passage, for example, the passage should read, and quite rightly, as Richard read it, it said, if a man desire the office of an overseer. It's not a bishop. Somebody just the other day online called me Bishop Steve, and I went, oh no, I'm not a bishop. I'm an overseer. And that produced a very interesting conversation. Very interesting. So Paul then is giving very specific teaching to Timothy to remind him what is involved in being somebody that's a leader in the church. Okay? And he starts in verse 2 and he says, an overseer must be blameless, the husband of one wife, and so on. I'm going to go through all of these things in a moment. But before we do, I want to take you back to what I said a moment ago. One day in the future, you'll be looking for a new pastor or a new overseer, whatever you want to call him. It doesn't really matter. But the important thing is you'll be looking for somebody, and you will have lots of ideas amongst you all as to what you're going to do. Somebody may say, oh, I've got an idea. He's got to be someone that went to college. Got to have a degree in theology. Has he? I haven't got a degree in theology. But I'm the pastor, aren't I? Right. Well, somebody may say, well, he must have gone to seminary then. He must have learnt theology. I meet lots of people that have been to seminary. A seminary is a college for preachers, and they go to seminary and they do their studies and they know all about the complicated words of theology. But I've had probably half a dozen people say to me, Stephen, will you teach me the Bible? Because we learnt all about theology, but we didn't learn the Bible. And we didn't learn how to preach. Somebody said to me just the past 6 months, will you teach me to preach? I said, certainly I will. But what you'll have to do is go to your church and volunteer to be a Sunday school teacher. That's where you start to learn to preach. Come in, everybody. Come and make yourselves comfortable. We'll wait for just a moment while you make yourselves comfortable. Good to see you again. Do you want to go into Sunday school? Okay. See you in a minute.
I'm glad you've come. The other family haven't come yet. They're busy.
Good to see you. Come a little bit closer, Chin. I know you're there, but you're a long way away. Good. Okay. So we won't start from the beginning, Chinna, but we'll pick up where we left off. Okay. So what Paul is saying then is this. He's saying this is the qualifications for being a leader in the church, an overseer. And somebody may say in the future, when I'm dead and past it or whatever it might be, they may say we need to have somebody that's been to college and learnt the Bible. Somebody else may say we need somebody that's been to seminary. See? And that isn't the qualifications that Paul gives to Timothy at all. Maybe we need somebody from our denomination. From our denomination. Well, one of the dear old preachers I knew from years gone by used to say, get all the silly talk behind you, first of all. Get all the children's talk. There's no such thing as denomination. There's no denominations. In fact, when we get to heaven, you'll find that there'll be no denominations whatsoever. We'll just be the children of God, that's all. We understand what people mean by various names, but we need to get beyond the denominational thinking. Somebody may say, well, what we need to do, we need to find somebody that is handsome, like me. Someone that's tall. Well, I'm not tall, actually, but I'm handsome. Somebody that's thinner. Somebody that's got a lovely voice to sing. Maybe somebody that's good with children. Do you know what? All these things, they're great things, aren't they? But that isn't what Paul talks about with Timothy at all. Funny, isn't it? What Paul talks about with Timothy he talks about features of character. Features of character. So, for example, in the future, make a note of this, Harley, that when you're looking for someone to replace me, you don't need someone that's handsome and tall and smart and all those things, and been to college and got a degree. What you need is someone of character. And Paul is going to explain to Timothy the sort of character that you need to be looking for. And these are all minimum requirements. You say, well, that's a very high standard. No, they're the minimum requirements. It's going to talk about being sober in a minute. Whoever you pick, don't pick a drunkard. See the point? We can't just say, well, let's forget about that one, and well, he's got all the rest. No. These are all the minimum requirements. There's no top limit to godliness, but there is a bottom limit. So let's look at it then. Verse 2, he says, an overseer must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach, not given to wine, no striker, not greedy for filthy lucre, but patience, not a brawler, not covetous. One that ruleth well in his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. For if a man not know how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being lifted up with pride, he fall into the condemnation of the devil. So that's just one sentence. They're long sentences, aren't they? Now what we're going to do then is we're going to just explain that. There's a lot of difficult words in there, old-fashioned English words, because I'm reading from the Authorized Version. He says, it is a faithful saying, if a man wants to be recognized as an overseer, then he's wanting to do a very good work. And may I say, there may be people here in this church today who may one day be the overseer or the pastor of this church. It's very likely that that might happen. Of course, it might be that somebody might come from somewhere else. So the question then is, what are the qualifications of character that we look for in someone that is an overseer? By the way, in the scripture, whenever it talks about overseers or elders in a church, it always is a little s at the end. It's always plural. It's always understood in the New Testament that in all churches there should be more than one pastor, more than one elder. There should be elders. Now, of course, it's a little church. They understand that you can't have 2 or 3. But that's the ideal. And in most churches of any decent size, 2 pastors, 2 elders, and so on would be certainly very possible. So he's going to list the various questions of character. Now the first one then is this. He must be someone about whom there are no public questions of impropriety. So for example, when the pastor walks down the street with his Bible in his hand and comes in the door, the people of the street standing by say, look at him, he's a thief. They don't say that. They don't say, oh, look at him, he's off with a woman. They don't say that. Why that? Because in the public space, he's a person where there are no questions about his character. Now, the second thing is that he is to be married in a way that is honourable. That is, he's to be the husband of one wife. Husband of one wife. Talking to a dear brother many years ago, and he said to me, well, the emphasis is on the one. I said, well, the emphasis is on the one. Yes, he is to be married to one. The scripture is very clear here that men who are married are men who are qualified to be the leaders in the church. After all, how can he have a wife and how can he have children that are well behaved if he isn't married? So I believe the emphasis is upon a married man. He is to be aware of the affairs of the world and of the affairs of the church. He's not a person that's got a blinkered, that doesn't see everything. He understands how the world works and he understands how the church works. He's to be a man of level-headed thinking. Now, you all know, don't you, that there are some people that are just a little bit crazy in the head, got some strange ideas. say the wrong thing, put their foot in it from time to time. That's not suitable. That's not the sort of person you need. We're talking about your future pastor here. These are the qualities that God is looking for in a pastor. He's to be a man of careful godliness. Careful godliness. Wow. We all know what that means. We all know people who are godly, don't we? That's what we need to see in a pastor. That's what Paul says to Timothy. He's to be a man who always gives aid to the lonely and the needy, taking them into his home. Now, that doesn't mean to say that he's always got somebody in his house, but he is known as being a person of hospitality. We use the word hospital to be a place of retreat, a place where people get better. Of course, it could refer to a place of refuge. But the pastor's home is a place that's like that. Of course, if he lives a long way away, it's difficult for him to do it for a local community, but he still has the hospitable heart. And really, hospitality is one of the key features of a pastor. He is able to teach the word of God effectively. Therefore, he must know the scriptures very thoroughly. If you asked a pastor in the future to come here and you said to him, tell me about the book of Ezekiel, you would expect him to be able to tell you without having to look it up. He should know the Bible. But he doesn't just know the Bible, he knows people. And he knows how to communicate it, and he knows how to preach. Okay? He will have been somebody that will have led people to Christ many times. He will also have been a person who has helped individual Christians through difficult times in their life. He will be a counselor, and he will have been an apologist. What's an apologist then? Somebody that's able to give an answer for difficult questions regarding the faith. He is not to be a man addicted to alcohol. Period. There's no excuse. He's not to be a brawler. Now, in some translations say he's not to be argumentative. There are people like this. And whenever you meet them, there's always something. There's always something that's got to be raised. Always another problem to be talked about. No, this man is a man of peace. This is a man who doesn't get into scraps, either physically or verbally. He's a man who always wishes to bring peace. He's not to be greedy for filthy lucre. That's money. That's filthy money. That's ill-gotten gains, or even properly gotten gains. But he has what's called avarice, one of the 7 deadly sins. Always thinking about how he's going to make a buck. Always thinking about how he can fleece the people of God for money. You don't need somebody like that. He is to be forbearing, patient. Forbearing means somebody that puts up with a great deal, is patient. And not money-loving. He manages his own house well, having his own children under proper control. Sometimes this is a great trial for ministers, for pastors, for teachers, a great trial. Because sometimes our children do not behave very well at all. But the purpose of the pastor, the purpose of the overseer is that he has control over his own children. After all, if he can't control a couple of little children, how's he going to control the church of God? You see, that's the point. How's he going to manage the church of God? And lastly, he says he's not to be a new Christian. So many young men start off in ministry at the age of 21, 22. And by the age of 30, they're burnt out. They've given everything. Billy Graham had this in his early days. Preached for 5 or 6 years, and then he found he got nothing else to preach about. Had to semi-retire. Get back to the Bible. Get back to the source of all knowledge. And then he came back into the world with full of knowledge. And this is very common. This is why many ministers move. They move after 3 years because they haven't got anything else to say. But the interesting thing that I've discovered is that the Bible is a bottomless well. It's just endless. I could preach every day of the week and I'd never, ever, ever run out of stuff. And that's what you need, somebody that will be somebody that has the maturity and the experience to be able to go back to the book. We talked about this last week. You're not interested in a pastor coming and telling you funny stories. We can have funny stories in the back room, that's fine. But behind the pulpit, it's about the scriptures and it's about what God has to say, not about what I think. And I will not share with you my politics. You're not interested in my politics. This is not the place for politics. This is the place for the scriptures. This is the place not for my opinion. This is the place for God's opinion. My job is to find out what God thinks and explain it to you. That is the purpose and nothing else. So he's not to be a new Christian. Why? Because we don't want him to become buoyed up with pride, with a sense of over-importance, because he then will fall into a trap set by the devil, which is conceit. We don't want that. Verse 7, moreover, he must have a good report of those that are without, lest he fall into the reproach and snare of the devil. So people out there in the world, if you have a pastor one day to think about and to pray about, go and speak to his boss. Find out what his boss thinks of him. Go and speak to his mum and dad who may not be Christians. Find out what they think of him. Speak to his brother. Speak to his neighbour. Find out what his neighbour thinks of him. If you find a good report from the people that know him best and are closest to him, then he is a candidate for the oversight, to be an overseer. So, thank goodness we can get to verse 8. Now in verse 8, Paul says this to Timothy. He says, 8 and 9, he says, likewise must the deacons be. So let's stop a minute. Likewise must the deacons be. So he's not talking about overseers now. He's talking about deacons. And he says that they're to be of the same character. God doesn't have a lower standard of character for deacons compared with overseers. In fact, God doesn't have a lower standard for anybody. If you're not a deacon or an overseer, God still expects the same of you. All of the things we've talked about, yeah, they're very important if you're a pastor, but they're also very important if you're not. Just the same. And the deacons are to have the same standard of character and standard of morals that the minister is to have. Likewise, the deacons must be grave. Now that word grave, it doesn't mean we put him in the grave. It means he's serious. He is serious, not double-tongued, not given to much wine, not greedy for filthy lucre. See, all the same things. Holding the mystery of faith in a pure conscience. Now, what is a deacon then? A deacon, the word deacon just means servant. A bit like the word minister, that just means servant as well. And the word deacon means somebody who serves the church, but he doesn't have to be a preacher. Because in the previous list, it said that he had to have an ability to teach. But when we come and look at the qualifications for the deacon, we don't see that. There's no responsibility to teach. But those that do teach qualify to be pastors and overseers in the church. Now the first he says, a deacon must be a serious person. It's great to have a laugh. I mean, I haven't really met pastors ever, or evangelists ever, that are mopey and have no sense of humour. I think the Lord had a sense of humour. I think the prophets, some of the things they said are hilarious. However, that doesn't mean to say that everything in life is a joke. No. There's a seriousness about the work that they're doing, even if it isn't involved in preaching. He says he must be a serious person. He is not to be, now take close attention to this, he's not to be a person who says one thing to one person and another thing to another person. Double-tongued. Two-faced. Deacons are not to be two-faced. We know what that means, don't we? We all know what that means. He is to be free from alcoholic abuse. I remember many years ago, a long time ago, first married. For some reason, I got a taste for wine. And I had to make a decision. What am I going to do here? And I decided I would never buy it, ever. And I would stop having it completely. Do you know why? Because I liked it. And there's certain things in life that you have to decide what you're going to do. I remember trying to teach myself to smoke, and I had to just learn not to do this. This is something that wasn't going to be part of my life. I'm not against it. I don't mind it, what anybody does. But for me, it wasn't what was going to be part of my Christian life. He also says, not greedy for money and possessions. If you're a deacon and you're handling the affairs of the church, maybe you're handling the money of the church, being greedy for money is not the right thing for you. He says, but they should be understanding and possessing a clear understanding of the truth of Scripture. There's no substitute for that. Both in theory and in practical Christian living. In fact, it's very interesting in the New Testament, when the apostles talk about doctrine, they're not talking about theory. They're talking about how you live. That's what they mean by doctrine. And the deacon is to be a person who has a knowledge of the Scriptures and with a clear conscience. Now that's a great thing. When you put your head on the pillow at night and you know that between you and the Lord, there's no problem. And if you find when that happens that there is a problem, you just get down by the side of the bed and say, Lord, I just want to put this away. I want to put it all away. I just want to say sorry. And as soon as you say sorry, he says, it's all dealt with by the cross, Stephen. It's all dealt with by the cross. But I'm glad you've said sorry, because that would have been a problem between us. He says, and also verse 10, he says, and let them also be proved. Let them use the office of a deacon, being found blameless. So he who wishes to be a deacon in the church must be tested first over a period of time and be found to be blameless. Blameless doesn't mean sinless. Nobody's going to be sinless. Blameless means that nobody can point a finger at you and say, look what you just did. That's blameless. Now then, verse 11. Even so, their wives must be grave. You know, it's great to have a wife that serves alongside you in the ministry of the Lord. But he says, if you're going to have a deacon, his wife must be in harmony with him in the work. She must also be serious, not a slanderer, sober and faithful in all things. So it isn't just the deacon, and it isn't just the pastor. It's the deacon and the pastor's wife, which also is important. And they're to be of the same godly Christian character. Now in verse 12. He goes into the deacon some more. He said, let the deacon be the husband of one wife, ruling their children well and their own houses well. If you can't run your own house properly, then what makes you think you're going to run the church properly? It's not going to happen, is it? Verse 13, for they that have used the office of a deacon well purchased to themselves a good degree and great boldness in the faith which is in Christ Jesus. That's a very strange sentence. Let me tell you what it means. He says those who perform well in this office as a deacon will have earned a good reward, and there will be confidence at the judgment seat of Christ. You may not realize this, Harley, but one day you'll stand before the judgment seat of Christ and you'll be rewarded as a deacon. How do you see? There's a reward for the deacon. There's a reward for overseers. There's a reward for the Christian that's faithful. There's a reward for all sorts of things. In fact, there's 7 different types of rewards that will be given. Now let's talk about being a church member. Verse 14. He says, these things I write unto thee, hoping to come and see you shortly. But if I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the ground of truth. So that'll take some explaining as well. Some of these expressions, especially in the Authorized Version, are really quite difficult, aren't they? But let me put it to you. He says, I am hoping to come and see you, Timothy. But because it might be a long time before I see you, I thought I might write this letter so that you will know what? So that you will know how to behave yourself in the church of God. Now, let's just stop a minute. God isn't just interested in your head and what you know. He's interested in your feet and your hands and what you do. In fact, he's interested in that first. He's interested in that first. He says, so that you will know how to behave yourself in the church of God. It's no good being a pastor or a deacon and you don't behave yourself. That's of no testimony. No matter whether your theology is right, if you don't behave yourself, it counts for nothing. Good, godly Christian behavior. The church comes, he says, from the living God, and it is the pillar and the ground of truth. Now, in the Old Testament, the concept of the pillar was a place where worship was made, where prayer was made. The ground of truth is the concept of the foundation, and the foundation is the apostles' doctrine. So what he's saying here is this, that the church, this church, is the place of devotion and a place of correct apostolic teaching. That's what this church is about. It's not just about teaching. It's about devotion. You don't come here just to listen and fill your head with ideas. You come here to worship. You come here to pray. It's a place of devotion as well as of sound doctrine. And lastly, he says, verse 16, and he says, and without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifest in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen of angels, preached unto the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up into glory. So there's no dispute about this. There's nobody arguing about this. The apostles' doctrine, which is the teaching of the New Testament, is the mystery of godliness. What do we mean by mystery? It is the teaching that God has given just lately that teaches you, every single one of you and me, how to live a godly life. That's what the scriptures of the New Testament teach us. He says, and Christ, he says, was manifest in the flesh. He was declared to be righteous by the Spirit. He was seen of angels in the resurrection. He was preached among the nations. He was believed on in the world. And he was received up into glory. Now, I don't know what you make of a passage like this. You may say, Stephen, I don't want to be an elder. Hey, that's okay. Not everybody can be an elder. You can't have all chiefs and no Indians. But the point is, if you're going to have a church, and elders are not necessary for the existence of a church. Got that? But they are necessary for its well-being. They're necessary for its orderliness. They're necessary for its correct teaching, which then leads to godly lives. So are elders important? Yeah, they are important. How are we going to pick the next one? Well, we've got the list here. We've got the list. You're looking for someone that loves the Lord, that leads a godly life, and someone that has the ability to teach the word. What a great honour that is.